Hello everybody, welcome to the next GeogPod. This time it's a revision GeogPod looking at diverse places and in particular delving into inquiry question 2. So just a reminder that this is not a replacement for your in-class learning. This is a revision tool to use, so please only use it for those purposes. Now, just a word of warning, the first two parts to this recorded presentation are actually linked back to inquiry question 1. And I'll be honest with this because I forgot to put them into the inquiry question 1 recording. So let's begin. You'd have started your first lesson here looking at these images. How many of these do you own? How many of these do you do or have done or do? And you'd have then linked this into globalization. So remember, this is part of EQ1 still. You'd have started to look at the impact of globalization on diverse places. You'd have recapped what globalization is because you'd have already studied the globalization unit. It was the first unit you studied at A level. And then you'd have looked at how does globalization influence and impact diverse places. So, as I say, you'd have started with a brief outline recap of what is globalization, about the interconnectedness of people, businesses, culture, and so on. And then you'd have linked this into transnational companies, TNCs, that you'd have done an awful lot of in the globalization unit. So you can see here that where the synopticity comes in, links between one unit and another. What you'd have then done is created yourself two little case study examples of TNCs, one being Starbucks, one being McDonald's. Just a bit of caution on the data that's hidden within these figures. It's from 2003. But this is looking at the spread of these two TNCs and how these two TNCs are starting to influence on culture and identity. What you'd have then looked at, and you'd have discussed in some depth in the lessons, is globalization, what it has resulted in. Now, this is just a very brief summary on the screen here. So again, do look back at the points in your more detailed notes from the lessons. And then you'd have delved into, created two case study examples, one looking at London, one looking at New York, and focusing down on the impact of globalization on these two major cities. You'd have then brought it together into a 6-mark exam question for a named diverse space, explain how globalization has created winners and losers. Now, the winners part of that question is looking at who has benefited, what are the good things, the losers, who hasn't benefited, what negative impacts has there been on people and places. After you'd answered the question, you'd looked at these summary points to see how you could have brought them into your exam answer. So pause this and just remind yourselves of some of the key points. You then move on to look at demographic change and cultural identity, in particular looking at the demographic transition model to begin with, which you did a lot of at GCSE, and then moving that into cultural identity. So you'd have explored, again, as you did at GCSE, in more depth, obviously, the DTM, looking at the 5 stages. What are the 5 stages? How birth rate, death rate, total population has changed during those 5 stages. And then really looking in depth at what lies behind the characteristics of each stage, which is summarized quite nicely in these 5 points here. Now, this is the basics. Again, go back to your notes that you made at the time and even bring in some of your GCSE notes as well to supplement the depth. So what you were then doing is bringing that demographic element from the DTM into this idea of cultural identity. And you'd have looked at 5 different pictures. 2 of the places you know well-ish, Shefford and Luton, Shefford being your local example and Luton being your contrasting place, but also other places like Leicester, Chelsea and Glasgow. And based on your perception of what you've heard in the media, on the internet, TV and so on, you'd have outlined your perception of those following places and how they differ. And we then bring that into the cultural identity. First of all, defining what cultural identity is, and then bring it into this wheel, which encompasses many different elements that lead into what cultural identity is, such as place, nationality, ethnicity, religion, community and friendship, family role, hobbies. It's an interesting one, hobbies. You wouldn't think that, but it is. Professions, your job, financial status and age. All of those form a person's own cultural identity. And you can see within the definition, there's two key words, self-conception and self-perception. What you'd have then done is look at two changes in people's cultural identity. You'd have looked at the Aboriginal people of Australia and the East, and looking at East London. First of all, looking at what the main cultural changes have been, and then the demographic changes. So you'd have then looked at other factors affecting the changing identity in a particular place. And you'd have looked at social integration, and you've looked at social mobility. What you'd have then brought that social mobility into is the hierarchy there, looking at the different levels of the hierarchy and the progression through those different levels as part of mobility. The next part of EQ2 looks at a bit more of a historical aspect, a bit of historical geography here of industrialization. So what is industrialization? Bring this back to Victorian London and how it was viewed during industrialization and why those views were in place. And then what opportunities does industrialization involve today? So you'd have started by defining what industrialization is very briefly, then adding a bit more depth from this video about industrialization in the 18th and 19th century. So again, look back at your notes, look back at the YouTube clip as well. And then a bit of picture analysis. So you've got two pictures here, one bottom left, one top right, of industrialization in the early 1800s in a city such as London. You'd have then compared those pictures and looked at what are the common features in those pictures, what does it tell you about industrialization, what are the problems, and then compared those to an industrial picture now, today. Similarities, differences. And then you'd have summarized the problems associated with industrialization. You'd have then brought industrialization back to the more modern day, where you'd have looked at China, who is, let me start again. The UK, for example, has already industrialized. We're past that process. We've evolved and developed beyond that in the demographic transition model. Countries such as China are now going through the process, mass manufacturing. And from the globalization unit, and when you get to the superpowers unit, you'll see exactly why that is. Nigeria is a very new country to this process. It is industrializing, but is much earlier on in the process. Now, don't forget, China is part of the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, with the small s of South Africa. Nigeria is the more recent countries of industrialization through the mint countries, Mexico, Nigeria, Indonesia, Turkey. And then you'd have looked at a particular mini example, looking at the Tianjin explosion in China, which is an example of the impacts of industrialization processes in the more modern era. So you'd looked at what happened, what were the impacts, and how does that link to industrialization. And then you bring this into perceptions. Now, a lot of this unit then moves on to look at this idea of perception. So people's viewpoints, I say people, it can be businesses, it can be different groups, their perceptions of industrialization. So if we were to plonk ourselves back in the 1800s doing industrialization, what would our perceptions be? And you can see there, they'd have been much more positive about the process, maybe because they didn't realize a lot of the issues that were being caused. But today, 2000s beyond, we look back on industrialization and have different perceptions. You can see they're much more negative in their viewpoints, more exploitative, more environmental damage, and so on. We should have controlled it more. And then you'd have brought this into a case study looking at Victorian London through industrialization and what it has transformed into today. And there's part of the document that you'd have looked at to create that case study example. And also this one as well. Again, pause this here if you want to remind yourself. It's all on the Google Drive as well. I've thrown this in now. There's a good online lecture looking at Northern UK, what next for the cities and the Northern Powerhouse. So that's a lecture given by Sheffield University. Do have a look at that lecture and supplement your notes and detail and knowledge on that element of diverse places. So, EQ2 then moves on to realities of urban life, looking at perceptions of some urban areas. What are some of the realities of urban life like, and how urban areas are portrayed? So, you'd have started by looking at this, excuse the bell, this song, Empire State of Mind, and you'd have listened to it and wrote a set of quotes that describe New York City. And there below are some of the points that you'd have come up with. And you'd have then brought this into the main characteristics of urban life. And again, this is a summary. You'd have gone into much more depth. So you'd have looked at living costs. You'd have looked at the environmental quality. You'd have looked at crime in urban centres and urban areas. And you'd have looked at the urban mix. And sorry, the ethnic mix as well. You'd have then been given this set of data, so 4 different locations, and you can crime data. And you can see, if you delve into the crime data, you've got violent crime, robbery, fire service incidents, drug offences. And you'd have had to decide, based on the data, whether that area is rural, urban, inner city, suburban. And then you'd have been given the locations: Liverpool, Kettering, Tower Hamlets, and Christchurch, and discussed why that data indicates it's, for example, in a city area, and why crime rates would be higher. You'd have then brought this into a skills task where you looked at another set of data, looking at the crime data dashboard from the Met Police, great website for crime data, and you'd have produced a visual representation of data in the choropleth map. And you'd have brought that choropleth map of London into this question: explain the patterns of crime across London. That then lead into your homework task, where you'd have looked at the University of Glasgow's document on theories and causes of crime. Take you about half an hour, and you'd have supplemented your detailed notes. Right, then EQ2 moves on to the media representations of undesirable places. So what role does the media have in influencing people's perceptions, basically? So you'd have first of all define what media is. The bit in green, you'd have looked at the different forms of media, and then made it clear that these forms of media influence and govern and change people's perception of places, projects, initiatives, and so on in different places. You'd have then spent a good half hour at least exploring Bradford, Manchester, Birmingham, and Winchester, looking at a range of articles, media articles, and you'd have created some case studies there of how the media is portraying those different places, sometimes very negatively. And then you'd have looked at this place called Jaywick, which is a seaside town in Essex. You'd done exactly the same thing, but you'd have looked at YouTube as the media source. What was it like? What's the area? What's going on? How is it portrayed? And again, you'd have been given another set of data, 6 different locations. You don't know which of the locations they are on the table. You've got violence, drugs, and vehicles. And then as a class, you would have made the decisions as to which set of data is for which location. And then you'd have rounded this off by making it clear, because over the last couple of the lessons in diverse places there, you've looked at both quantitative data and qualitative data. That led into your homework, where you'd have created a case study going back to your Luton and Shefford examples, where you'd have looked at media reports on local news of Shefford and Luton and summarised the positive and negative aspects of those media sources. EQ2 then moves on to the perception still, but this time in rural areas, and looking really at the rural idyll. started off by analysing these old paintings of rural areas and coming up with some descriptive words of what the rural idyll is often like. You'd have then defined what the rural idyll is as a concept, and the lecture I'm going to refer to at the end really outlines is the rural idyll actually in existence? Is it reality, or is it something we've socially constructed? I've thrown this in now. You wouldn't have done this in lessons, but do have a look on the internet or just at this PowerPoint really of the 1997 Cloak's Index of Rurality. And what Cloak tried to do, this links back to the rural urban continuum really that you studied at the start of Diverse Places. He tried to map visually the different elements of rurality, going from the extreme rural to the intermediate rural to the intermediate non-rural, right up to urban areas. He tried to map it. So do have a look at that theory. What you'd have then been given is 4 questions. Again, this is data from people's perceptions. So the questions they were asked were, there is less crime in the countryside, and you would have to guess, if you like, predict, would people strongly agree, disagree for each of these? The countryside is a better place to bring up children. The countryside provides a healthier environment to live in. There is more community spirit in the countryside. And what you'd have then discussed is, how would that data have been collected? What are those perceptions being based upon? And then you would have been given this long list of bullet point statements. And you would have needed to apply these to these 3 different areas of rural above: commuter belt rural, accessible rural, and remote. You'd have then discussed in depth together the commuter belt characteristics and what is the commuter belt as part of the rural, an accessible rural area, which is different from commuter belt, and then the more remote rural areas, which is often what people see as the rural idyll concept. You'd have then brought this very nicely into a county that is often considered majority rural of Cornwall. And you'd have developed your case study looking at the positive and negative aspects of rural Cornwall. You'd have used a range of sources, so look back at the textbook, look back at these slides that are on the Google Classrooms and the Google Drive. And as I said, I've thrown this in now. Do look at this recorded lecture, which is on the Google Classroom, given by Debbie Perlman-Hughey of the University of Hertfordshire, and she lectured about half hour, 40 minutes on what is the rural idyll, how it's been developed, what is it, any issues with it. Great for this part of Diverse Places. And then, sort of started this in the previous lesson there, you're going to look at how can you investigate people's perceptions of place. So you'd have started looking at how can people's perceptions affect their view on cultural issues and demographic issues. So remind yourselves of those. You'd have looked at what factors can affect people's perceptions. So you'd have had a general discussion to begin with, and then you'd have narrowed it down into these 3 different elements, mainly of urban areas: house prices, crime, antisocial behaviour incidents. And you'd have discussed it in some depth that how house prices, crime rate, antisocial behaviour, how those 3 variables influence people's perceptions. Because if you were to look at house price and crime rate data, for example, of a place, you develop a perception of what that place is like based upon that data, and also antisocial behaviour data as well. What you'd have then done is applied this. You've given a set of data for the districts of Manchester, average house prices, and the reported antisocial behaviour incidents. You'd have then completed a scatter graph. Now that isn't completed at the bottom right. So once you've plotted your points, what you'd have seen is the line of best fit goes from top left to bottom right. So you'd have had what looked like on the graph as a negative correlation. What you then did is apply this to a Spearman's rank. It's vital you know what Spearman's rank is as a statistical test for your exams. So you'd have followed a set of instructions as to how to do this. So you'd have ranked each of the house prices and antisocial behaviour from 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest. You'd have then worked out the difference between the two ranks, and then you'd have squared the difference. And that's what you'd have come up with. So just pause it to remind yourself. What you'd have then done is use the Spearman's rank formula to calculate. So there's the formula. There's how it's calculated. You'd have ended up with a Spearman's rank of minus 0.6, which obviously is a negative correlation, meaning the higher the house price, the less antisocial behaviour. Makes absolute sense. So the data has sort of proved what you would expect. Wealthy areas, less people, bigger homes, people with better jobs, have less antisocial behaviour than the poorer areas of an urban area. So that brings you to the end of your inquiry question 2. As I said at the beginning, this is for revision purposes as a reminder of the different elements for inquiry question 2. Make sure you use your detailed class notes, the textbooks, all the other material out there to help you revise. Thank you very much, folks.